Good evening and welcome to Novara Live. I'm an unfortunately very sunburnt Helena, aka NoJusticeMTG, and tonight I'm going to be joined by Mike Bankole. Mike, to quote a famous singer from the early 2000s, it's been a while.
It has been a while. I've been away since March. This is my longest hiatus from Novara since I started co-hosting the show. So glad to be back. And Helen, I've got some great company. So glad to be on the show with you. So I'm in safe hands and looking forward to what's going to be an interesting show.
Thank you very much for joining us. Absolute pleasure to be joined by you tonight. Speaking of which, coming up tonight, how long will Rachel Reeves survive as Chancellor? Could Yvette Cooper be forced to prescribe Yvette Cooper? And why Nigel Farage is completely wrong. Again. Stay tuned for all of that and more. And if you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. And make sure to let us know your comments on the YouTube chat, or you can, of course, tweet at us on the hashtag NovaraLive. Before we start tonight, a reminder that tickets are on sale for the next Downstream IRL. Ash will be talking to historian William Dalrymple at Earth Theatre in Hackney on July 29th. Tickets are available via the link in the description. 2 days on from the debacle over the government's welfare reform bill, much of the media have been speculating over which member of the government will be the sacrificial lamb to save Keir Starmer's government from its own failures. The use of a fall guy to pin the blame of a leader's political failure on has been a staple of British politics since time immemorial. Boris Johnson, for example, regularly diverted away from his scandalous administration by pinning the blame on a government minister, such as with the resignation of Oliver Dowden after the Partygate scandal that saw the Tories lose 2 by-elections in a row. Keir Starmer's authority as both Prime Minister as Labour leader was shattered by Tuesday's humiliating climb down on pip cuts, triggered by a monumental backbench rebellion. Things reached a head yesterday in Prime Minister's questions, when Leader of the Opposition Kemi Badenoch took a swipe at Chancellor Rachel Reeves over the economic consequences of the U-turn.
Mr. Speaker, he talks about jobs. Unemployment has risen every month since Labour took office. Has he spoken to Nissan, by the way, and looked at what's happening there? This man has forgotten that his welfare bill was there to plug a black hole created by the Chancellor. Instead, they're creating new ones. They're creating new ones. She looks... Mr. Speaker, she's pointing at me. She looks absolutely miserable. Labour MPs, yeah, she looks absolutely miserable. Labour MPs, they can point as much as they like. The fact is, Labour MPs are going on the record saying that the Chancellor is toast, and the reality is that she is a human shield for his incompetence. In January, he said that she would be in post till the next election. Will she really?
Prime Minister! She certainly won't. Mr. Speaker, I have to say I'm always cheered up when she asks me questions or responds to a statement, because she always makes a complete mess of it and shows just how unserious and irrelevant they are. But she talks about the black hole. They left a £22 billion black hole in our economy, and we're clearing it up. And I'm really proud, Mr. Speaker, that in the first year of a Labour government we got free school meals, breakfast clubs, childcare, got £15 billion invested in transport in the North and the Midlands. We're cutting regulation, planning and infrastructure is pounding forward, building 1.5 million homes, the biggest investment in social and affordable housing, and of course, Mr. Speaker, the 3 trade deals. Remember the ones that they couldn't get, including the US trade deal. On Monday, those tariffs came down. That secured the jobs at JLR. That's who we care about on this side of the House.
How awful for the Chancellor that he couldn't confirm that she would stay in place.
Human shield? Is she accusing Keir Starmer of being Hamas? Now, it was during Starmer's response that the now famous clip of Rachel Reeves with a tear rolling down her face emerged. And it was this, plus the fact that Starmer wouldn't confirm whether or not Reeves would stay in post, that sent Fleet Street abuzz with speculation. For example, here's a characteristically diplomatic thumbnail from Times Radio's YouTube channel. She looks haunted. Traumatized Rachel Reeves could be replaced within days. Number 10 was quick to quell the rumours last night, with Keir Starmer joining Nick Robinson's Political Thinking podcast on the BBC to pour water on the idea of Reeves being ousted anytime soon.
You know, she's made it clear it's a personal matter, and I'm not going to go into the personal matter of a colleague. What I will say is that she's done an excellent job as Chancellor. We have delivered inward investment to this country in record numbers, £120 billion. That'll be measured in jobs. We've created conditions for wages to go up, and we've jointly worked on the spending review, which is very broadly popular. She's done a fantastic job. She and I work together, we think together, and in the past there have been examples, I won't give any specific, of chancellors and prime ministers who weren't sort of in lockstep. We're in lockstep.
People assumed it was because of politics. That she decided to quit, or you'd said to her, Rachel, I'm sorry.
Look, firstly, Nick, is
that wrong?
It's wrong. I can just tell you that. That's absolutely wrong. Got nothing to do with politics, nothing to do with what's happened this week. It was a personal matter for her. I'm not going to intrude on her privacy by talking to you about that. It's a personal matter. But
so when the leader of the opposition says you should, and I'm not going to probe into it, but she says the public have a right to know, and I think the argument would be made, look, the state of a chancellor, and this is brutal fact about politics, isn't just about the person, it's about UK PLC, it's about the price that the bond markets demand for government borrowing, it's about business confidence. Brutal though it is, people need to know.
Well, look, it was a personal matter for the Chancellor, and I've been absolutely clear with you. It's got nothing to do with politics, nothing to do with any discussion between me and Rachel, nothing to do with the matters of this week.
So she'll still be Chancellor by the time this interview is broadcast in full in a few days'
time? She will be Chancellor by the time this is broadcast. She'll be Chancellor for a very long time to come. Because this project that we've been working on to change the Labour Party, to win the election, change the country, that is a project which the Chancellor and I have been working on together. So, yes.
Now, there was a very interesting point hidden in that exchange, which is that there is an economic cost to political disunity and the perception of the government's stability by the bond markets. Is there any truth to that, though? Well, last night, during the frenzied speculation over the Chancellor's future, gilt yields, the interest paid on government debt, did spike when it appeared Rachel Reeves might get the boot. This is from Reuters. Investors are monitoring Reeves' status after the British government's reversal on welfare reforms meant the plans would no longer save taxpayers any money, shredding the margin Britain relies on to meet its fiscal rules. The welfare reform U-turn was signalling that the Labour Party is a lot less concerned about what the gilt market thinks, said Gordon Shannon, portfolio manager at 24 Asset Management. I would have thought it was seared into politicians' memories what happened to Liz Truss. The yield on the 10-year government bond or gilt rose as much as 22 basis points on the day one point to 4.681 as investors ditched British debt. It then recovered somewhat to 4.60%. So there is at least some truth that either the potential for Rachel Reeves' exit or the U-turn on the welfare bill had spooked investors. And if we needed confirmation as to which one of those was the case, here is the market news today upon the confirmation that Reeves would be staying in post. UK government bond markets rally after Starmer backs Reeves. Bond yields fall, reversing a sharp rise on Wednesday, sparked by speculation over the future of the Chancellor. And if we look at a graph of gilt yields, this confirms this is indeed the case. You can see the large spike yesterday, followed by the sharp fall today, showing at least that part of market confidence in the government is linked to Rachel Reeves staying in post. Now, it's funny to me. So you'd assume that the market reaction to this is over this idea of Reeves being the quote-unquote Iron Chancellor. Oh, well, if we don't have Reeves as the Chancellor of the Exchequer, then they would put somebody else from the Labour Party and they would be more fiscally reckless than Rachel Reeves, which doesn't really make much sense to me. When Rachel Reeves being in the position that she's in, it's actually because of her links to Labour Together. It's the link to the Starmer Politburo, to the inner circle of the Labour right very, very specifically. I don't think, given that the direction of policy usually is tied to McFadden or McSweeney, rather than Reeves and Starmer themselves, that if you did replace Rachel Reeves with, I don't know, like a Torsten Bell or a Darren Jones, the policy, or indeed the commitment to the fiscal rules and the fiscal probity that the markets demand, I don't think that would change very much, which I find quite interesting, that the markets are irrational enough to pin their confidence in the government on her specifically, rather than actually understanding the reality of what a plan for government is, what they're planning to do with the economy, and indeed the faction that has kind of dictatorial control over the Labour Party right now. It doesn't seem like those people who talk about the gilt or bond markets as being this completely neutral arbiter, or those that are completely rational. That seems to be a little bit untrue as far as I'm concerned. Now, this wasn't the only reaction that was inspired by the sight of Rachel Reeves weeping in Parliament. Much of the online discussion around it centered on Reeves herself. Many were sympathetic to the plight of Rachel Reeves. Here's journalist Sangeeta Miska. Politics is brutal. The welfare cuts are highly controversial. Labour is struggling on many fronts. But seeing Rachel Reeves in tears at PMQs was really quite upsetting. The official explanation is personal reasons. Whatever it is, on a human level, I hope she's okay. Similar sentiments were echoed by money-saving experts Martin Lewis. I would never want to be a chancellor for all the money in the world. Incredibly tough job, impossible ask, especially over the last decade. How would you try to piece together the misshapen independent jigsaw pieces of consumer issues business, the economy, bond markets, stock markets, job markets, world economies, tariffs, and more? People often lambast chancellors as quote-unquote unqualified, but no one is qualified to do such a broad job. Ultimately, it is a political role for someone with hopefully some understanding of wider economic, financial, and consumer issues. We have to give some respect to those who try, even if we disagree with their decisions, as no one will ever get it all right. Others, however, were less sympathetic, such as Labour MP Diane Abbott. Politics is much more important than a game of parliamentary snakes and ladders. The real issue here is impoverishing hundreds of thousands of disabled people, and the real anxiety they have as the government decides to fill it in its empty welfare bill. Now, I kind of have to say, I fall between these two camps on this one. So whilst when it comes to Rachel Reeves, I do see all of the issues that come with being chancellor. You know, people will see you as the ultimate figure of hatred, as the one who has the levers over the public purse, you know? Whereas, as I said before, I think that most of the control over government policy is down to people in the Starmer Central Circle, like McSweeney and McFadden. So, as someone who's read a bunch of Rachel Reeves' older work, I quoted her own words at her when her public persona was a little bit more left-wing than it was now, about the need for tax rises, the need for economic redistribution, not focusing specifically on growth, but on where that growth goes, how we shape the economy, right? I've seen her be more left-wing than she is now. I think there's some potential to the idea that maybe she isn't one of these kind of like right-wing Labour MPs, but is someone of closer to the kind of centre soft left of the party who would be happy to do more if she had those levers at her disposal. But there was a political choice that was made by McSweeney, by McFadden, one would assume, in terms of the tax rises that they thought were political no-go zones. Regardless of whether there might be some utility to raising them in the abstract, they had shut themselves out of raising income tax, VAT, and raising things like council tax under the assumption that they couldn't win the election if they were having these things on the table. So Rachel Reeves is very constrained. Of course, her fiscal rules are her choice, but constrained in terms of what her allies have deemed politically necessary. The problem, of course, is where I lose sympathy is that those her allies of choice. She had options whether she would part of like an open Labour faction. She could have done that. She could have decided to bridge the gap between the more hardline Labour right-wingers and people who are more open to collaboration with kind of the broader party at large, to happy to play around with being a little bit more left-wing more openly. But she didn't make that choice. She put the interests of herself and her career and the political interests of the Labour right over the interests of the broader public at large, over the interests of the disabled people, again, which is rightly pointed out by Diane Abbott, are the real people at the centre of this, the real people who are going to have real material consequences, which people like Reeves and Starmer will not ever see any of those material consequences at all, because they're earning six-figure salaries, which is where all of my sympathy goes away. All of my sympathy goes away, right? As soon as you're, like she was in 2014, saying things like, oh, we're going to be tougher on benefits than the Tories, one can only assume, because they thought that was where the political mood was, the people who kind of had Liz Kendall's campaign in the 2015 leadership election, or we've lost the argument on benefits, so we're just going to capitulate, then that's tough. You made that choice, Rachel. You made that choice, and you're going to have to make the fact that you've made your bed part of your political brand. And so you can't really get upset when those political choices that you've made come back to bite you. There was one group, however, who had a far more mystifying reaction. The lobby journalists seem to have decided that the real victim of the mess around the government's welfare reform bill are the parliamentary whips, apparently. First up, we have a now deleted tweet from Patrick Maguire, political editor for The Times. Is this what regime welfare rebels were voting for? Do they comprehend what they've done to this government's political authority? Ah, yes, how dare backbenchers put the concerns of the most vulnerable in society over the nebulous political authority of the Starmer Politburo? The discourse reached a surreal nadir this morning with the release of this has-to-be-seen-to-be-believed article by the iPaper political editor by the iPaper political editor Hugo Jai. The bullies in Westminster have lost their power. A fractured parliament is not only bad for the government, it is also bad for the country. Yes, you heard that right. It is actually bad for the country if MPs act in the interest of their constituents. I wonder how he can justify such a statement. Let's read on, shall we? Most of Labour's 403 MPs owe their careers directly to Starmer. They may think they have a personal mandate from voters, but in reality, it was the red rose next to their name which got them the job. Our political system cannot operate if backbenchers are regularly willing to defy the leaders on issues which are central to the government's agenda. Of course, the whips of the past went too far, but party discipline is an essential part of parliamentary government. It helps to transmit the instructions of voters as a nationwide whole, not just local interests and unrepresentative online pressure groups into legislation. Now, there are two glaring problems here. The first of all is that even if we accept that it is the Labour brand and party affiliation that is most to credit for these MPs being elected to Parliament, then it's not just Starmer who they owe their electoral success to, is it? Trust our lobby journalists to reduce the entire Labour movement and its adherents down to a single man and his political strategist. People vote for Labour because of what it stands for, or at least what it is supposed to stand for, and the broader values which that red rose represents on the ballot paper. Are we seriously supposed to believe that people vote Labour to take money away from the disabled? But crucially, the main document on which political parties pitch their agenda for governance, which Hugo was so pained to see undermined by the backbench, is their electoral manifesto. The question is, of course, what did the manifesto say about the disabled? Well, unfortunately for Hugo and indeed for Keir Starmer, it says nothing. Nothing at all about cutting PIP. In fact, it says quite the opposite. Labour is committed to championing the rights of disabled people and to the principle of working with them so that their views and voices will be at the heart of all we do. Every charity and advocacy group that represents the disabled was opposed to the Welfare Reform Bill, and it was one of the many 11th hour concessions by the government to even bother committing to listening to their concerns with regards to the Timms review before implementing the brutal cuts to PIP. Does that sound like having the views and voices of the disabled at the heart of everything the government does? And even beyond that, Hugo's broader point is that the government's job is to be able to use its majority to implement the policy as the instructions of the nation as a whole, which I'm happy to concede isn't unreasonable. Every government claims they want to govern for everybody. Yet the nationwide whole doesn't even support the PIP cuts, right? Not even reform voters, the demographic that Morgan McSweeney is so desperate to win over could support these reforms. The only voter group that did were Tory voters by a very, very slim 4-point margin, and the overall numbers showed only 26% supported the reform as opposed to 40% who did not support them. So if we want to blame anyone for the political disunity of the Labour Party, if anyone can be accused of damaging the government's political authority, the buck must and can stop with Keir Starmer himself. He lied to his members, he lied to the voters, he even lied to his own MPs. There was no mandate at all for these cuts, either electorally or indeed in polling and the national picture, and the backbenchers rightly gave him the kicking he so richly deserved for trying to hoodwink both them and the voters with the draconian bill. But I suppose this is what happens when you put the grown-ups back in charge. Mike, how long do you think Rachel Reeves or Keir Starmer can even last after all of this?
I think they'd be under immense pressure. So you're looking at some of the polling numbers, and Ipsos Mori released some polling numbers this morning. Labour have fallen from 34 to 24 in terms of their polling numbers. Now, that might not sound like a lot, but that is a double-digit drop in popularity in your first year in government isn't normal. It hasn't happened that often in recent years. Even when we saw the Johnson government, for example, the last time it happened, in fact, was the major government of the 90s, kind of the early 90s. And we now see Keir Starmer polling at around minus 54% when it comes to popularity. So at the moment, Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves pursued kind of welfare cuts that were deeply unpopular broadly, and their popularity, both the Labour Party and his popularity, is declining. Now, I think Rachel Reeves will be the first to go, is my view. I think for her, this is a big deal because obviously her authority has been undermined. She pursued this kind of ideological project, really, when it comes to welfare, which kind of prioritised kind of fiscal cuts over kind of social justice, in my view. And she will, I think, unfortunately pay the price for that at some point. Unfortunately for her, anyway. And I do think that for Labour, there are some more questions they need to ask because, as you mentioned, Helena, they're pursuing policies that aren't kind of they didn't receive any mandates for, and they're also pursuing policies that aren't popular. I think when you're a new government and you're in your first year in office, you want to secure some small wins to kind of get some popularity, get some people on board, and be like, oh, these guys actually might be half decent. When you think of Labour's first year in office, we're about a year away from a year post-election now. They've been in office for a fair bit of time now, so we can kind of assess things. There haven't been no small wins you can look at and hang your hat on and be like, well, Labour are doing some good things, or Labour are doing some sensible things. There isn't really a clear story at the moment when it comes to what Labour are trying to pursue more broadly as a story to tell the nation we had your backs. So at the moment, what Labour are doing actually is making themselves more and more unpopular. Now, I guess when it comes to the Keir Starmer question about how long Keir Starmer's going to last, a lot of that depends on the opposition. Now, I think at the moment, the de facto opposition in British politics are reform, because when it comes to Labour's messaging and how it tries to angle itself, it is at times discursively trying to respond to reform, right? So we saw Keir Starmer's speech a couple of months ago on immigration. We become an island of foreigners. That was discursively a response to reform and trying to kind of wrestle the kind of control reform have over the immigration debate and say, no, we can be just as authoritarian as reform on immigration, at least rhetorically. That was definitely the pitch from Labour. Now, look, reform, I don't see reform winning an election, is my view. I think to go from 5 MPs, I think it is, to however many are required to win an election would be incredible if that was to happen, in terms of like, we've never seen anything like that happen before. But reform would probably, unfortunately, win more seats at the next election. A lot of Keir Starmer's kind of future relies on what does the Conservative Party do, in my view, in terms of, can they get a leader in? I don't think it's bad knock, by the way. Can they get a leader in who can put sufficient pressure on Keir Starmer and build a movement, or build kind of some kind of Conservative movement again? Now, if that happens, Keir Starmer will be under a lot of pressure. But I do think for now, despite the polling numbers dropping, despite the growing unpopularity of Keir Starmer, he'll have enough to hang on for now. But what I would say is, the more Labour pursue these policies that are deeply unpopular, these policies that attack the most marginalised society when it comes to the disabled, when it comes to so many marginalised groups in society, the more Labour ideologically commits to these policies and principles, the more difficult they make it for themselves, right? And there's no need for Labour to do this, right? Labour needs to secure small wins, and part of securing small wins is making them as marginalised in the country feel you have their backs. Now, if Labour aren't willing to do that at this current moment in time, when it's such an easy thing to do, when will they do it? It's a really bizarre position that Keir Starmer and Labour got themselves into, because again, as you say, Helena, we don't have a mandate for any of this. So it is just totally bizarre.
That is the thing, right? Is that the actual election manifesto was essentially a pamphlet, an empty pamphlet to get them over the line. That was the strategy. You just say things like, well, we have no plans for this. None of our plans in our manifesto require us to raise taxes. And they thought they could hoodwink the public by going, oh no, everything's way worse than we expected. We have to do all these unpopular things now. As if that could be a justification anyone would expect or that they would appreciate, right? Because despite people in the media getting mad at people being angry with the government because they were dealt a shit hand, it's true. The government were left an absolute mess by the Conservative government that was previously before them. And so actually, the public do genuinely have a lot of sympathy with this problem. A lot of people, when you look at focus groups more in common, have done quite a lot of these. A lot of people have specifically said, well, actually, I would have given these people a lot more time to be able to deal with the mess. We've got plenty of leeway for them. But what we don't stand for is the lies, the lack of sincerity, the disingenuity, and the feeling that MPs are taking voters for a ride, treating them like they're stupid. And they don't realise when they're going back on promises, when they're going back on their manifesto commitments, and when things that were said before the election don't match things that were said afterwards. And again, that's where my sympathy for Rachel Reeves runs dry again. It's because these are things that were being done with no mandate, as you say, because they didn't think they needed one. They could just say, we are the adults in the room now. We are the natural party of government, quote unquote. Now the Tories have bungled it post Liz Truss, and people will give us more room. And there was plenty of room if you'd have been honest, right? Country screwed up, needs to do tax rises would have been a perfectly reasonable thing to say to the public during the election campaign that I think they would have been voted in, maybe not with a giant majority, but at least they would have won. And that would have given them so much more leeway to do what they're doing currently without pissing off huge stakeholders in society, especially those who are part of the Labour movement and the Labour kind of electoral cohort like the disabled, because everyone has disabled friends. You may answer in like some kind of poll, really kind of dispassionate poll that you want to see welfare come down, or you think too many people get disability welfare. You know, you may answer that discursively. But if you don't think about it, and if you give them time to think about it, a lot of people go, well, actually, now we've got the legislation being made, we don't like it, because actually we do think that the disabled need help to be able to live, if they can't wash their own undercarriage, for example. And this is where the popularist strategy of the McSweeney Politburo completely falls off. It's because unless you can command people's thoughts, unless you can drive the narrative and drive an agenda that brings people to you and brings people with you, rather than accepting that the public are right about everything and triangulating every position, it makes you look insincere, it makes you look disingenuous, and it makes you look like you have no vision. And people, at a time where the whole country seems to be falling to hell in a handcart, they want to see some vision, and that's something that we're not seeing from the current government. On Wednesday, MPs in the House of Commons voted to proscribe direct action group Palestine Action as a terrorist organisation. But by Thursday morning, a new group was making quite a splash online. That video of a lorry being vandalised was accompanied by this post on social media. Breaking. Newly launched direct action group Yvette Cooper targets Time Logistics, who transport weaponry for Israel's biggest weapons firm. If you want to ban Palestine Action, you'll have to proscribe Yvette Cooper too. Something I never thought I would ever say. We are all Yvette Cooper. Now, the other Yvette Cooper, the slightly less cool one, the Home Secretary, was overwhelmingly supported by MPs in her quest to ban Palestine Action. After the debate on proscription, 385 MPs voted to label direct action protesters terrorists, with just 26 voting against our rights for political free expression. Now, the Home Secretary had bungled Palestine Action. Now, the Home Secretary had bundled Palestine Action with two neo-Nazi white supremacist groups on the proscription order. Those groups, unlike Palestine Action, have threatened violence to people. That made it harder for MPs to vote against the order, but still, the vast majority of our lawmakers didn't even raise an objection to the Home Secretary's plans. A handful, however, stood up for my right and your right to continue to say we support a group that damages the properties of arms firms profiting from genocide.
Why has he linked these three organisations together? He clearly has made a judgment on each of the three organisations independently of each other. And I think it would be fair, and I'm sure many outside would think it would be fair, if we were taking individual votes on the three. Because many of us are very concerned about the issue facing Palestine Action, and that is the issue that we wish to address in the debate here today.
Is he aware that several UN special rapporteurs, including those protecting human rights, say that they have contacted the UK government to say that acts of protest that damage property but are not intended to kill or injure people should not be treated as terrorism?
This heavy-handed approach threatens basic freedoms and sets a dangerous precedent for all political dissent in the UK.
When the suffragettes carried out a campaign of window smashing, poster paint defacement, cutting telegraph and railway lines, targeted bombing and arson, specifically avoiding harming people.
I oppose the blood-soaked hands of this government trying to silence us. So I say this loudly and proudly on Wednesday, the 2nd of July, 2025. We are all Palestine.
Order!
No, we're not.
After that debate, Zara Sultana also made an important point of order about a fellow MP who spoke in favour of proscription. That was John Pearce. No, not the guy who voiced Robot Wars. He's the Member of Parliament for High Peak.
Point of order, Zara Sultana.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. During the previous debate on the proscription of Palestine Action, the member for High Peak, who I have notified, spoke without declaring that he is chair of Labour Friends of Israel and has accepted hospitality and overseas trips funded by pro-Israel lobby organisations. The House was discussing a non-violent direct action group that directly challenges the Israeli state, which is on trial for genocide against the Palestinian people. Can you advise me, Madam Deputy Speaker, on what mechanisms are available so the British public are truly aware of what interests are being represented on this floor?
I thank the Honourable Lady for her point of order and indeed for having given advance notice of it. The procedure for raising a complaint of this sort is by writing to the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards, and it is not a matter for the Chair.
I mean, she raises very important points, right? There are lots of people in our parliament who have loads of connections to the Israel lobby, who are members of either the Conservative or members of Labour Friends of Israel. Lots of people have received donations from people who lobby for Israel, who are Zionist lobbyists, essentially. And so the people need to understand when prescription orders like this go through, they need to understand where those loyalties lie. They need to understand who's being under the influence of who, because again, when you have things like lists of people, members' interests, for example, a lot of people in our media, a lot of people in our political class treat those lists of members' interests as well. As long as I sign off on it, I can put all of this information up here, and that means that it's above board. But the only reason it's above board is so that people can make informed decisions over who they elect, who they support, and whether or not that they can trust their parliamentarians, right? And this is stuff that's out in the open, so it's very right for Zara Sultana to highlight it. Otherwise, what's the point of having the list of members' interests in the first place? Now, some support for Palestine Action has also emerged from the House of Lords, where the proscription order was being debated this evening. Peter Hain, now Lord Hain, a former Labour minister under Tony Blair, said this. In 1969-70, I was proud to lead a militant campaign of direct action to disrupt all white racist South African rugby and cricket tours, and we successfully succeeded in getting them stopped for 2 decades. No doubt I would have been stigmatised as a terrorist today rather than vilified as I was then. This government is treating Palestine Action as equivalent to the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda, which is intellectually bankrupt, politically unprincipled and morally wrong. Frankly, I am deeply ashamed. Update. The Lords have just minutes ago passed the prescription order, meaning Palestine Action may be prescribed as a terrorist group in the early hours of Saturday morning. But the Direct Action Organisation has secured a hearing tomorrow morning for interim relief. If granted, the Home Secretary's prescription will be paused while Palestine Action seeks a judicial review, which could overturn it. Mike, those were some particularly strong contributions in the chamber by a lot of the representatives who were supportive of Palestine Action. Where do you think things go from here?
It's really difficult to say. I really hope this is overturned just because I think it's such a massive overstep and it's such an overreach. And it sets a really worrying precedent. I mean, I saw the Novara statement the other day and totally agreed with every single word of it. You know, I think what Palestine Action are doing is property damage, of course, and there are laws that kind of criminalize that. But to say it steps over the line and is an act of terror is deeply worrying and deeply problematic and sets a worrying precedent, I think, for broader kind of acts of political dissent. And I think Britain is a country in many ways built on acts of political dissent. You know, people so proudly talk about suffragettes and all they achieved. They, you know, committed loads of acts of property damage that would now, in some ways, maybe seen prescribed as a terrorist group, which would be absurd, by the way. So I think we need to really be careful here. And people might think, oh, you know what, it's Palestine Action, so it doesn't really affect me too much. But no, it could be a group and a cause you deeply care about. And I think a lot of this is about how the British state is choosing to respond to any dissent in the name of kind of free Palestine or more broadly. I think this is about delegitimizing the movement. So if you prescribe a group as a terrorist group, it isn't just Palestine Action that label sticks on, by the way. That label sticks on maybe anyone who's flying a Palestine flag, who's wearing a Palestine pin, who's got a watermelon on their Twitter name, or whoever it might be. It's about delegitimizing the movement more broadly because the British state is committed to providing cover for Israel. So I think a lot of this is about the kind of broader British state reaction and response and continuing kind of apathy towards the plight of Palestinians. And that for me is worrying. What I would say is, and I was really encouraged by the kind of rebrand to Yvette Cooper because I think it does show that people are still willing to resist. And people are still willing to resist with satire, be bold, be courageous. And I do think we have to kind of commend that because I think in the face of such adversity and such pressure, there's this kind of satirical response to this. And I think it also highlights the absurdity of prescribing them as a terrorist group. So I've been kind of really worried about this and been really kind of bothered about this for the last couple of days because it just feels like such an overreach and such an overstep. And yet, you know, in a couple of days' time, if I was to say, you know, some of the words I'm saying now, in terms of speaking for Palestine Action, that could become a real problem. So it's really worrying where we are at the moment and the kind of real pushback we're seeing against any dissenting action in favour of the Palestinian people in Britain. You know, it starts here and who knows where it could end. So I would love to say something optimistic, Helena, about where I think this could end, about how this could be overturned. But at the moment, I just feel so despondent with the kind of current state of British politics, with the current state of affairs when it comes to the British state's position on Israel. And I was hoping there'll be some shift on the start. Look, I wasn't expecting anything massive. We kind of know what he campaigned on and how he spoke about kind of Palestinian lives prior to being elected. But I did expect some kind of tonal shift. I did expect some shift. And what we're seeing actually is a continuation of the rhetoric, you know, and a continuation of some of the things we saw under the Conservative Party. And in many ways, this overstep here in prescribing Palestine Action as a terrorist group suggests that Labour Party actually are willing to go quite far on this and willing to kind of frame an entire movement as kind of this kind of terrorist movement that should be feared. And that's a real problem.
Yeah, the links with the previous Tory government are really well founded in terms of their ideological commitment to smearing the pro-Palestinian movement in this country. I remember Swilla Braverman talking about the marches for a ceasefire as being quote-unquote hate marches, right? All of these different conflations of criticisms of Israeli policy or Zionism or the ideologies behind it with the things like anti-Semitism, for example, those claims of yesteryear just kind of crept up again and again in public discourse. And that gets represented again when people within our politics will always use the most kind of visceral language or indeed the most draconian policy to target the pro-Palestinian movement whilst being super lenient and indeed forgiving rhetorically for the pro-Zionist movement, even though it is, of course, the Zionist movement itself that is why we're in this mess in the first place, because that's why there was a problem with the occupation in Palestine. So it's very frustrating to hear this double standard continue to crop up in terms of when you look at both sides of this discussion. Unfortunately for the general public, our media organisations can't get enough of giving Nigel Farage a platform to be able to wax lyrical about his latest raison d'etre du jour. And today was no different. LBC's Nick Ferrari had him on the show today to take phone-ins from the public, and one of his answers on the show has been going semi-viral. Here's what Farage had to say about the state of our politicians.
I think the way we run our country is ridiculous. We put cabinet ministers in charge of departments over which they have absolutely zero knowledge. They'll often last in that job for 12, 18 months. I mean, barely time to get their feet under the table and understand the brief. But we're stuck in this mindset, Kevin, that the cabinet must all be politicians in the House of Commons. Why? Why? It's nonsense. Look at America. Scott Bessent has come in as the US Treasury Secretary. Never stood for election in his life, but a very, very successful businessman.
So who are some of the people you might have your eye on?
Oh, I'm not going to give you answers like that right now.
But a cabinet under Nigel Farage, you wouldn't have to be the MP for Upper Whoop Whoop. No. You could be a hugely successful businessman or woman who ran a supermarket chain for 10 years.
Or whatever it may be. But I do think, I really mean this, I do think that you've got to think a little bit more about running the public finances as if you're running a business.
Now, in a 50-second long clip, it's easy to see the appeal, at least to people who aren't of my political persuasion, right? Voters have been treated to a cavalcade of ministers who have quite clearly not been up to the job, and public trust in politicians is at an all-time low. It's very easy to not have much trust in a system that allowed Kwasi Kwarteng to be in charge of the economy. Now, it is currently perfectly permissible to have industry experts in cabinet or ministerial positions under current parliamentary rules, through an appointment through the Lords. Look at current Prisons Minister James Timpson, who was brought in due to his personal expertise in hiring ex-offenders and chairing the Prison Reform Trust. It's an impressive resume, and so far he seems to have done a pretty good job given the absolute mess he was handed by the Tories. Although Farage's example is quite the opposite. US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has plunged the dollar to its worst start in any year since 1973, overseen historic Treasury sell-offs, and undermined confidence in the broader US economy with his scattershot international trade policy and tariffs. Also, as an aside, how very patriotic of Farage, not only to want us to copy the Americans, but also to sing the praises of an ex-employee of George Soros and one of the central figures who tried to destroy the British economy on Black Wednesday. So patriotic. The issue, of course, is that the government is not supposed to be run like a business for a lot of different reasons. First of all, governments have multiple priorities such as general well-being, human development, societal cohesion. Businesses have only one goal, which is to maximize profit for shareholders. Where a business would have to maximize efficiencies to do this, it has no other stakeholders. A government has to have redundancy to be able to respond to crises and the needs of its citizens. Government is there to mitigate the negative externalities of the market paradigm, which people who've only ever been in business would never understand. What Farage appears to be advocating for is a form of Hayekian technocracy. Now, for those who don't know, Friedrich Hayek was a neoliberal economist, well known for being an inspiration to Farage's hero, Margaret Thatcher. His theory was that democracy undermined the economy by allowing people to advocate for a distribution of resources that was politically rather than marketly distributed. The solution then follows is to instead have an economy managed by unelected expert technocrats rather than by politicians, solely concerned with maximizing market liberalism rather than social utility. So it's not surprising then to hear this kind of thing from Nigel Farage. the kind of people he shares his time in Parliament with and who donate to Reform UK have the most to gain from this. Bankers, financiers, property tycoons, and the rest of the economic elites. And what's more is that Reform aren't even shy about the fact that they're a party of the elites. Here is newly minted Reform MP Sarah Pochin expanding on what Zia Yusuf said on the Question Time about a party representing those who set their alarm clocks in the morning.
Now, with this Labour government's policy and your constant attacking the wealthy and they're leaving this country in their droves, we know they are. It's fact.
Well, okay, listen.
That's where the taxes are going. What an ill thought through policy.
I am so sick and tired of hearing the rich are just going to leave this country if we make them pay a little bit more tax. If that is the position, you and others may well stand up in the House of Commons, look straight at the camera at the British people and tell them I'm being held hostage by the super rich in this country because if I put up their taxes by 1 or 2%, they're going to leave this country. That's not how politics works. We're not held to hostage by billionaires who say, hey, if I have to pay more, then I'm going to leave this country. I'm sorry. I'm a patriot. I believe in this country. If these British folk
so far. You can only push people so far.
We have one of the lowest...
People that get up and set their alarms in the morning, go out to work, employ people in this economy.
What's really funny is it's the people who are out there employing people who don't set their alarm clocks in the morning. The kind of people who would benefit from Reform UK's policy, the super rich, the oligarchs, all these type of people, right? These people make money in their sleep. CEOs are the ones out there not actually going down and setting their alarm clocks to be able to get up, to be able to clock in for 9 a.m., 8:30 a.m., whatever it is, right? They're the ones who roll out of bed to go tippy-tappy on their MacBook in Starbucks, and they go to a couple of business meetings, and that's their work for the day. Right? The kind of people that she's talking about, the kind of people who they want to attract to be job creators, quote unquote, even though that is a very nebulous term, which misses out that it's demand that creates jobs in the economy rather than the kind of special brains of the entrepreneurs, right? Like, those are the people who are not represented by the term setting one's alarm clocks in the morning. Those people are the working class of this country. Those are the people who do go out to work and work night shifts, who set their alarm clocks for 3 a.m. You know, there are plenty of people who are covered by that phrase who Reform UK don't represent. Because the biggest tax breaks in Reform UK's manifesto for the people, right, their contract, it was all to the biggest businesses, it was all to the super rich, right? They gave some paltry handouts to the poorest in terms of the lifting of the basic rate of income tax with what they were proposing. But that dwarfs, even in percentage terms, let alone nominal terms, from the big tax breaks that they were going to give to the richest. It's no wonder he praises the people who have Trump's economy under their fingertips, like Scott Besson, because they're the ones who are happy to have things like the Big Beautiful Bill, which is there specifically to transfer money from the poorest to the richest in terms of cutting public services that only the poor rely on to give tax breaks to the rich who would never use those public services in the first place. Now, the issue, of course, is that there's no real space arguing against this from the left, at least not in terms of the political sphere, right? The party political sphere, as the real people who set their alarms in the morning are not represented at all in Parliament. The traditional party that would be the avenue by which working people, rather than career politicians or the professional elite, would be elected to Parliament has been captured by that same professional class. The only person with a top government role who's really held like a blue or pink collar job is Angela Rayner. And she was elected by members. Do you not expect her to be there if she was picked by the party elite headed by Knight of the Realm Sir Keir Starmer, Casey, would you? They have fixed a number of MP selection to block those same working class candidates from being longlisted to Parliament, such as bus driver Sean Halsall from Southport or Greg Marshall from Broxtowe. One of the most egregious examples of this was the blocking of Lauren Townsend in Milton Keynes, a teaching assistant who was a lifelong trade unionist and hard-working Labour member. She's the kind of person who the lifeblood of the Labour movement is built on, and she was blocked from the long list to give Chris Curtis, a former YouGov pollster and political friend of the Starmerite think tank Labour Together, a free run in the sea. So with no working class representation in Parliament, there is no case to be made for an alternative to either professional political class or to the professional business class. Now, circling back around to Farage's original point about ministerial experience, most ministers don't have direct experience in the field of their brief. But that's what the civil service is for. That's what political advisors are for, right? You can learn these things on the job if you have a certain vision. But the lack of real-world experience that connects with the public is what is missing. Now, the Attlee ministry didn't have many industry experts, quote unquote. But what it did have were miners, teachers, weavers, lorry drivers, dockers and printers, people who'd been given a life of service to their community. They knew what life was like for working people because they were working people. And this was the greatest government in our nation's history. Luckily, there is a group that is pushing for more working class representation in Parliament. Blue Collar Parliament is run by David Littlefair, and he spoke about his ambitions on the Politics Joe podcast.
In terms of goals for Blue Collar Parliament, one of them would be to speak to, and I have been doing this, I've been speaking to local parties around the country to demonstrate just how big the drop-off's been. And I'm having that kind of conversation where people are saying things like, things that is probably not great or it's a good thing that it's not well known that Labour members have these kinds of attitudes. But, you know, they'll say things like, well, we've already got Angela Rayner. Or they'll say things like, well, Lee Anderson, he's working class, would really want another one of him. Or they'll say things like, you know, we don't want to choose like a nurse over a high-flying lawyer because we don't want to punish success or be seen to punish success. So there's an ingrained attitude there that really, really needs to be campaigned on long ahead of the next election, because, you know, where those people are choosing the next set of candidates, you know, they need to be thinking about that in the back of their minds. In previous generations, we started using all-women shortlists, and those all-women shortlists massively increased the number of women who were brought into Parliament through Labour. I don't think you could really do an all-working-class shortlist, but that kind of consciousness of who you're choosing, I think, needs to be filtered down to the grassroots. And I also think that there needs to be legislative change around helping people to run for Parliament as well. So there was a scheme to help disabled people run for Parliament called the Access to Elected Office Fund. And I think a version of that you could apply to if you're in a key worker career, or if you were at a certain income bracket or something like that, that would help you run, help fund some of your time, give you some time off to work, would be really, really massively helpful for just helping those people have the time and ability and capability of running.
I certainly would agree with that. Absolutely. This is what we really need if we really want to rebuild trust in politics and have ministers who are in touch with what the public wants. And whilst I'm not saying we can't have any experts in Parliament, be they in business, economics, science, or law, they just can't be the exclusive class of politician. And just as our Parliament should be representative in diversity of gender or race, so should it be in class. And this should also, by what it's worth, is not just apply to the Labour Party, right? I'm a Green Party member personally, and I think we'd be able to make a much better case of being able to be perfect representatives of our constituents, of building a new kind of politics, if Labour aren't going to do it, in my own party as well. Mike, what do our governments need more of, in your opinion? CEOs or blue-collar workers?
Well, I've always thought one of the problems of our politics, Helena, is we haven't got someone like Stephen Bartlett in there. So maybe more CEOs. But no, if I'm being serious here, I think one of the problems we have in our politics is the cost of politics when it comes to running for office, as we saw in that clip discussed briefly, is so high, right? So if you want to run for a seat, you have to often sacrifice tens of thousands of pounds in terms of earnings, so you can essentially devote a lot of your time to working that seat, right? Now, if it's a seat that's not particularly safe, you're going to have to probably sacrifice a lot more time to work that seat and to try and become the MP for that seat. Now, what that does is that locks out a particular class of people from running for office, right? That makes it easier for someone who's worked in business, maybe to run for office, someone who's worked in finance to run for office. It makes it far harder for the care worker, for the teacher to run for office, right? And when it comes to one of the problems in our politics, right, the reason why people have lost trust in politics is because so many of the decisions made by politicians, people think, well, actually, are these people, given their backgrounds in business and in finance, going to even feel the consequences of the decisions they make? Probably not, right? So people feel detached from the people that govern society. Let's be clear, the lifeblood of this country are the people that are working in care and in education and in retail, who are driving the night buses, who are driving the night tube, who are driving the trains up and down the country. That's the lifeblood of our country. Yet we see very few, if any, of those people in politics. We have 650 MPs. How many of them have had to clean blood from a hospital floor? How many of them have had to pay rent? How many of them have had to kind of drive a night bus? How many of them have lived the lives that tens and thousands and millions of people across Britain are living today? That's why people are looking at politics with like a lack of trust. It's very, very simple. If you're a young person growing up in Britain, maybe you have kind of working class parents, your dad's a bus driver, your mum works in the NHS, you're not seeing anyone who looks like your parents in politics. So why on earth would you engage in a process? You feel so detached. It feels so detached in your lived reality. So I think we're creating a generation of people who become more and more detached with politics. We're creating a class of politicians who have worked in business and in finance and in law, who are very privileged, who live very privileged lives, who are governing for the rest of society, who haven't lived these privileged lives that they've lived. So I think it's a real problem, and it creates a real disconnect. And I think we do have a class problem in politics, right? So I do lots of research in my field on race and representation in Parliament. And we've seen massive strides made when it comes to race in Parliament, right? So we now have 90 MPs from a black and minority ethnic background in Parliament. That's a good thing. When we break that number down and look at who these people are, lots of people have worked in maybe kind of really working class jobs, particularly on the Labour side of things. But more broadly, they represent kind of a very similar in class to the kind of the white MPs, come from kind of business backgrounds and law backgrounds. And again, this isn't me hating on people who are successful. It's more, well, actually, does that represent kind of makeup of minorities in Britain more broadly? It doesn't. Lots of minorities are concentrated in the care sector, in the NHS, for example, right? So much minority workers. Why aren't we seeing any of those people elected in office? Those voices are really, really important. And I think a real shift in our politics that's needed is the voices that we value. Because so far, we value these voices of people who work in business and finance, whatever it might be. And we don't value the voice of the care worker who contributes massively to looking after vulnerable people in Britain, who looks after and makes life better for so many people in Britain. These are really important voices that need to be listened to, that need to be heard. And if we want to have rapid transformation in terms of quality of policies and how well these policies meet the needs of British people, guess what? Give ordinary people a seat at the table. So I think Farage and some of his ideas are a bit bizarre. And Farage has mastered the art of talking like a bloke in the pub, when actually a lot of his policies feel like a CEO's wish list. And that's not what this country needs.
I absolutely agree with you. And the really important point about how class is so pervasive in British politics, it's so pervasive, right? And what I think is quite interesting is there's real kind of divergence in terms of the kind of class that you get in terms of conservative and reform, right? Because what's ironic about Farage's comments is we have had people with quote unquote business experience in positions in government. Like, who do you think is the kind of makeup of the Conservative Party when it comes to their ministerial roles, right? It's people who have worked in big business, right? Look at Nadeem Sahami, worked in the petrochemicals industry for his entire life. You got serial landlord, Jeremy Hunt. He was also a government minister under the Conservative Party. We've had every kind of flavour of kind of business owner, I guess. I was going to use a really rude word there. I really avoided that. Glad I did. But that's been people who've been in positions of power already. Did that lead to a good functioning country? I don't think it did. But there's a different class, right? Rather than the kind of people who come up through the Conservative Party are usually from the kind of aristocracy of this country, right? They're from the kind of more public school background. Yet, despite there being a lot of privately educated people in Reform UK, or who are part of the kind of the bigwigs of Reform UK, their supporter base and the kind of people who are drawn to them actually do come from less of a public school background. The kind of nouveau riche people, they more support Reform UK. The kind of people Aaron Bassani would describe as quote unquote family capital. And so those are the kind of people who do see some level of support when it comes to wanting to bring in successful business people, right, who come from new money rather than the old money of the Conservative Party. So I guess there's that difference there. But regardless, right, we only are at this position where we're just deciding which kind of business people, which kind of professionals that we want to have in Parliament, because there is this real kind of classism against people running for Parliament whilst being just a normal working class person, right? These people have been completely removed. And it even comes into where we talk about politics, right? In terms of with upper class people, this never gets questioned that they have no experience. Like, that was Nigel Farage's main point, was we don't have ministers with experience. And you see this when it comes to Rachel Reeves. Like, I hate to defend her again for the second time this stream, but one thing that she keeps getting attacked for is her apparently having very little experience, being described as quote unquote Rachel from accounts. Now, I think that maybe there is some truth to those accusations, and where I have some disagreements with her. Like, I don't think she's done very well as Chancellor of the Exchequer. But George Osborne was also Chancellor of the Exchequer. He had less experience in the region as Rachel Reeves did, right? That guy studied modern history, right? George Osborne did, and worked as a journalist. What economic experience does he have to be Chancellor of the Exchequer, right? Did anyone smear him as being George or Gideon from reception? Well, no, it's because he's upper class, right? He came from a public school background. He went to Oxford. That's why he never really got that thing kind of questioned. And whilst it's absolutely fine for people to question people's suitability for a ministerial role, there is still a huge class element. Whereas if you're from the kind of upper class in this country, people will get away with it. They'll get away with having no experience, right? And so that makes it even harder for people from normal class backgrounds to be able to succeed, because even if you have kind of a small amount of experience, people will attack you as long as you're not from who are perceived to be the mainstream political class. So these are some huge problems, some really big problems. And if you want to find out more about how to get more working class people in Parliament, you can go to bluecollarparliament.co.uk to find out more about what David is doing with that programme. Well, thank you, Mike, for joining me this evening. It was a pleasure to have you back.
So good to be back, and hoping to be back more often.
Absolutely, absolutely. We look forward to it down here. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.